The next covenant that we're going to look at may well be called the Forgotten Covenant. It's right there in the book of Numbers, chapter 25, and yet it's not one that you often read about. It's a covenant that's made by God with Phineas. If you remember, Balaam could not curse the children of Israel because every time he would soothsay, God would turn what was supposed to be a curse into a blessing, which was not what he'd been employed to do. So rather than do that, what Balaam decided to do was to mingle the people of Israel with the nations round about, the Canaanites. And what that did is that polluted the worship of the one true God. So badly, in fact, that right in front of Moses and the elders, an Israelitish man brought in a Canaanite woman and went into his tent to lay with her in the camp of Israel. This shows you how badly things had got, and also how quickly we can turn away from respectability into complete lasciviousness. And Phineas, who was the grandson of Aaron, took a javelin, we're told, and went into the tent and thrust the javelin through the man and the woman. And a plague that had broken out from God in the camp was stopped because of that action. Now, because of the zeal of Phineas, God makes a covenant of peace with him and his descendants. Well, Phineas was to be the high priest one day. And so this means that God was making a covenant of peace with the high priesthood from the line of Phineas. Now, this covenant is called an everlasting covenant in the context, just as the Noahic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant is called an everlasting covenant. The Mosaic covenant, it has aspects in it which are everlasting, but in itself it's a temporary covenant. So this everlasting covenant, therefore, has got to be something that we're to look out for in the rest of the Bible. And in fact, there are various places in Scripture where God calls attention to this very covenant. One of them is in Psalm 105, which is a historical psalm, and in that, the author draws attention to what Phineas did and this covenant of peace, this everlasting covenant that is made with Phineas and his descendants. We also find in various places promises given to the Levites. Now, it is true that not all of the Levites were righteous. For example, some of the Levites were connected to Abiathar, who was displaced from the priesthood by David because he went with Adonijah. And yet we find that Zadok, who is a direct descendant of Phineas, that he is blessed and he is given the high priesthood by David. That's instructive because in the book of Ezekiel, in the temple vision at the end of the book, we are told, particularly in Ezekiel 44, if you'll read that the Zadokites are separated off from the rest of the Levites to enter into the holy place of God to offer the sacrifices and do the service of God. They can actually come near to God, we're told. The other Levites, they can just kind of serve around the periphery and help out, but they are disconnected from the Zadokite line. So there are Levites and Levites, you see, in the Old Testament. And when it talks about the promises given to the Levites in, for example, Jeremiah 33, or in the book of Malachi and chapter 2, we should keep in mind really mainly the Zadokite line, although the other Levites also will be involved. As this is an everlasting covenant that's been made with Phineas and his descendants, I hope that you can see that they've got to have somewhere to sacrifice in. They've got to have somewhere to do their work. And that will either be a tabernacle, as it was in Moses' day and Phineas's day, or it will be a temple, as it was in Solomon's day and thereafter. This means that the temple that we read about in the book of Ezekiel, and it's not just in Ezekiel 40 through 48, although that would be enough, but we also read about it in the prophetic passages in Ezekiel 36 and 37, where the sanctuary is particularly prominent. We also read about it in Jeremiah 33, where the sons of Levi are given particular covenant promises that are recalled by God, even at the time of the Babylonian captivity. It's in these places, you see, that we see the intent of God to have a purified, using Malachi's terminology, Levitical priesthood. And the reason for that can only be because of the covenant that God made with Phineas. A person might object, yes, but haven't you read the book of Hebrews? After all, the book of Hebrews is unambiguous about the fact that Jesus has been the final once-for-all sacrifice that has done away with the necessity of the Day of Atonement sacrifices, or indeed the daily sacrifices that were offered at the temple. And of course, that would be right. But we must also note that the book of Hebrews carefully tells us that the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. And therefore, there is no necessary problem, no contradiction at all, between saying that there will be a sacrificial system in the future, as well as the once-for-all sacrifice of Christ being sufficient for the covering of the sins of God's elect people. There's no problem about those things at all. What exactly the role of the sacrificial system will be in the future under the terms of the new covenant, we'll have to wait and see, quite honestly. I don't believe they're just going to be a memorial sacrifice. I think that they will have something to do with the salvation of unsaved peoples in the kingdom, and we'll get to that in time. But whatever it is, we can leave that problem, as we can leave all of the problems that may be created, at least from our vantage point, by covenant promises, to God, because he can resolve them. He knows exactly what he's doing and what he's going to do in the creation project. Now, in Zechariah 14, in a clearly prophetic passage, we see that the nations will not be able to have rain in their land if they don't come up to worship the Lord, who is clearly divine, at the temple at the Feast of Tabernacles. That's a future prophetic prediction. It's not happened yet, of course, but it will happen. But they've got to be able to come up to the temple in order to do it. It even talks about the pots and pans of the temple being gold and so on. Talks about offerings. So clearly, if that setting is to be believed, then there will be a future temple, just as there will be a purified priesthood, as Malachi and Ezekiel both predict. So yes, there will be a perpetual sacrifice that will be memorial. It will be also probably for a recollection of the sins that were taken upon himself by Jesus in that once-for-all sacrifice, and so for a recognition of that, and for other reasons too that are not quite so clear. We may, though, have to answer the second objection a bit more bluntly, a bit more clearly, which would be, but hold on a minute, the Levites functioned under the auspices of the Mosaic covenant. So if the Mosaic covenant is temporal, then clearly the Levitical covenant, or the covenant made with Phineas, has to also be temporal. Well, no, it doesn't. You see, there are differences between Ezekiel's temple and the temple of Solomon. There's no Day of Atonement, for example, in Ezekiel's temple. Some of the functions of the priests are different. Certainly the differentiation between the Zadokites and the other Levites is not there in the Old Testament, the other Old Testament books. Moreover, the Levites weren't to have land in the Mosaic covenant, but they are given land around the temple of Ezekiel 40 through 48. So there are other differences too. No high priest, for example, either. So clearly we're not dealing with the Mosaic covenant when we're dealing with Ezekiel's temple, or indeed with the temple in Zechariah 14, or I think in Malachi 2 or Jeremiah 33. So no, there is no problem as far as the Mosaic covenant is concerned. The covenant that is made with Phineas transcends the Mosaic covenant.